let's look at the k-means clustering algorithm. The k-means clustering algorithm is again a widely used algorithm in unsupervised machine learning. So we have discussed, let's get an overview. Again, we have discussed supervised learning, right? And again, in supervised learning, we know the target variable. It's either a categorical variable as in classification or a continuous variable in regression. So in other words, the variable that we are predicting, we know that variable, it exists in the data set, right? In clustering, we don't know the target variable, right? And we have to find for we have to look for patterns. We have to find similarities within the data set to sort of cluster the points together in order to develop a predictive model. So again, clustering is partitioning, right? It's a task of partitioning the data set into groups called clusters. But again, even within the same data set, you can have different patterns that you're looking for. So for example, in these collection of objects, you can cluster these objects based on color, right? Or you can cluster the objects together based on the shape, and you can also cluster the objects based on the size. So again, in every situation that you have to decide what pattern, what is your final objective, and what are the patterns that you're looking at. And that's the tricky part in k-means clustering algorithms. And in a way, you can think of it as a limitation. So let's look at like a simple example, right? You have, let's say, a collection of points, right? And you're trying to find you're trying to cluster similar points together, right? And so when you apply the k-means algorithm, what the k-means algorithm does is to find similar clusters within your data set. And so how does the k-means algorithm do that? So it uses an algorithm for that. And so what the algorithm does, it starts off with some random locations. Right? Now it chooses the data set. It chooses random locations in the data set, right? And then it finds the distance between each observation, right, and the case centers that it randomly chooses in the data set. We'll look at a pictorial representation also, but let's go through the steps right now. So then the observation, right, is assigned to the cluster of the nearest point, nearest center point. Now, and it uses a distance measure, typically a Euclidean distance measure, which we have discussed before. It uses the Euclidean distance to find the distance between each observation and the case centers that it has randomly chosen. And so the next step it does is it moves the center points to the means of those clusters. And it keeps on repeating that until there's no changes in the cluster membership. Okay, let's look at a pictorial representation of what I just said. So let's say that you have these clusters, right? And now what the first step the algorithm does, it assigns these random points, right? So these are random locations that it assigns, right? The first step that we talked about. These random locations are created. Now it calculates the Euclidean distance, right? And assigns a particular cluster, right? Based on the Euclidean distance, right? The closest points, right? Now, once that is done, right? The points, let's say, closest to this, right, are assigned to this cluster. The points closest to this center are assigned to this cluster. The next step is these centers are going to be moved to the mean, right? The average of these points, right? It's going to be somewhere over here. The average is over here for this. The average is over here somewhere in the center, right? So the points are then moved. The cluster centers are then moved to the mean positions of the clusters. Now the centers. Now the step is repeated then, right? It again calculates Euclidean distance and assigns the center to that cluster, and then it again moves those centers to the mean of that cluster, and then keeps on doing that. Now in these three steps, you can see that the position of the cluster centers, right, does not change, especially in these two, right? It does not change. Now, once there's no change, the algorithm stops and then assigns the cluster. You can see that it's natural that this algorithm is going to function better if the data is already distributed in clusters, right? So again, that's one of the limitations of this algorithm. Here's another pictorial representation where you have these data points, right? And then these are the clusters. These are the centers that are randomly chosen. And this step is sometimes called expectation. And then the cluster centers are then moved, right? These centers, the random centers that we started with, are moved to this to the cluster centers, which is the mean and the average of the points. And then this process is repeated until, again, the centers do not change. And again, as I said, there are some limitations of the k-means cluster algorithm. One of the most important limitations is that you need to to decide on the number of clusters, right? So, for example, if you're working with the iris data set, right, you know from we know that there are 3 species, right? But if you use the k-means clustering algorithm for that, it can be tricky. If you already know that there are 3 clusters, then it makes it easy. But if you don't know that, then you have to make a guess, right? Or maybe do a grid search or something to see what is the best, what are the best clusters that you can find in that data set. And the algorithm assumes that the clusters are convex shaped, right? Like the ones we saw, right? They're like you see that they're circular, right? So it assumes a particular shape for the clusters, and that's also one of the limitations. And we have typically seen that if there is like a distance measure in the algorithm, like a Euclidean distance that's being calculated, as in these centers, right, that are randomly assigned, their distance is calculated to each observation, right? So whenever this is the case, you should standardize the features, right? Otherwise, you can the predictions are not really good. So and as we can also see from the way the algorithm works, if there are outliers, right, the presence of outliers can skew the results. Because again of the Euclidean distance that is calculated, if there's an outlier, the Euclidean distance can be a really large value, and that can skew the results. And another thing that the algorithm assumes is that the clusters, right, are similar shapes, densities, and sizes. As we can see over here, that the clusters, right, are similar, they're shaped in a similar way. So if these assumptions are not met, the algorithm's function might not function properly. The predictions might not be really good. But it is one of the widely used algorithms in cases where you don't know what is the target variable. And in such scenarios, you can always try using other clustering approaches for your data set.